The morning of September 8, 2022 began like any other autumn day at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. The ancient stone walls that had sheltered British royalty for generations stood silent against the misty landscape, unaware that history was about to change forever. Inside the castle, Queen Elizabeth II, at 96 years old, was spending what would be her final hours surrounded by the rolling hills and heather-covered moors she had loved since childhood. William and Catherine were at their home in Windsor when the call came. It was a call that every member of the royal family had known would come someday, but no amount of preparation could have readied them for this moment. The Prince of Wales, as William was known then, answered his phone to hear the solemn voice on the other end delivering news that would change their lives forever. His grandmother, the woman who had been the steady heartbeat of the British monarchy for over 70 years, was peacefully slipping away. The drive to Balmoral felt endless. Catherine sat beside William in the back seat of their car, watching the Scottish countryside blur past the windows. She had married into the royal family 11 years earlier, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. She was about to become Queen Consort, a role that would transform her from the Duchess of Cambridge into one of the most watched women in the world. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her as they raced through the Scottish Highlands. William gripped her hand tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He was thinking about the conversation he'd had with his grandmother just weeks earlier. She had pulled him aside during a family gathering and spoken to him with the wisdom that only comes from 7 decades on the throne. "The crown is not just a symbol," she had told him, her eyes bright with the fire that had never dimmed despite her age. "It is a responsibility to every person in this realm and beyond. When your time comes, remember that you serve not yourself, but something far greater." Those words echoed in his mind as they approached Balmoral. The castle came into view, its familiar turrets and towers now seeming to loom with an almost ominous presence. This was where his great-great-grandmother Victoria had spent her final years, where generations of British monarchs had found peace and solitude. Now it would be where his grandmother would draw her last breath, and where he would step into a destiny he had been preparing for his entire life. The family had gathered. Charles, William's father, was already at Balmoral, having arrived earlier that morning. The man who would become King Charles III in a matter of hours stood by his mother's bedside, holding her hand and speaking softly to her about memories they shared. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, was there too, her usual stern demeanor softened by grief and love for the woman who had been not just her sovereign, but her mother. Catherine felt like an outsider in this most private of moments, even though she had been part of the family for over a decade. This was royal history unfolding, the end of an era that had defined not just Britain but much of the world. Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, when the Beatles were topping the charts, when man first walked on the moon. She had guided the United Kingdom through the Cold War, through economic booms and busts, through the changing landscape of the modern world. As the afternoon wore on, the family took turns sitting with the Queen. When it was William and Catherine's turn, they entered the room quietly. The Queen looked peaceful, her face relaxed in sleep. Catherine had always been struck by how small the Queen appeared in person, how this tiny woman had commanded such respect and wielded such influence. Now, seeing her lying in the great four-poster bed, she looked even more fragile, like a delicate bird at rest. William knelt beside the bed and took his grandmother's hand. "Granny," he whispered, using the pet name the family had always called her. "Catherine and I are here. We love you." The Queen's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Her gaze moved to Catherine, and for just an instant there was a spark of recognition, of approval, of love. "Take care of him," the Queen whispered, her voice barely audible, "and take care of them all." Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face, understanding that these words were more than a request from a grandmother to a granddaughter-in-law. They were a charge, a sacred duty being passed from one woman to another. The Queen closed her eyes and never opened them again. At 6:30 that evening, surrounded by her family, Queen Elizabeth II passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle. The woman who had been the longest reigning monarch in British history, who had been a constant presence in the lives of millions of people around the world, was gone. The moment she died, everything changed. Charles became King Charles III instantly, by divine right and constitutional law. William, who had been the Duke of Cambridge and second in line to the throne, suddenly found himself heir apparent, the Prince of Wales, the future King of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. And Catherine, who had been the Duchess of Cambridge, became the Princess of Wales, a title that hadn't been held by anyone since William's mother, Diana. But more than titles, had changed. In that quiet room at Balmoral, watching the woman who had been the backbone of the British monarchy for 70 years slip away, William and Catherine both understood that their lives would never be the same. They were no longer just senior royals who could pick and choose their engagements, who could maintain some semblance of privacy and normal family life. They were now the future of the monarchy, the couple who would one day wear the crown and carry the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Phone calls had to be made, protocols had to be followed, arrangements had to be set in motion. The Prime Minister was notified, and within minutes, flags across the United Kingdom were flying at half-staff. The BBC interrupted regular programming to announce the Queen's death, and within hours, the news had spread around the world. William and Catherine barely had time to process their grief before they were thrust into their new roles. There were decisions to be made about the funeral, about the period of mourning, about the countless details that go into transitioning from one monarch to another. But through it all, they leaned on each other, finding strength in their partnership that had begun as a college romance and had grown into something much deeper and more enduring. The next morning, they stood together in the drawing room at Balmoral, looking out at the Scottish Highlands where the Queen had loved to walk and ride horses. The mist was lifting from the moors, revealing the stunning landscape that had provided solace to generations of royals. Charles, now King Charles III, joined them, his face etched with grief but also with determination. "We have work to do," he said simply. "Mother would want us to carry on, to honor her memory by serving as she served." William nodded, understanding that this was not just about continuing traditions, but about adapting them for a new era. The monarchy that he and Catherine would one day lead would be different from the one the Queen had commanded. It would need to be more modern, more accessible, more in touch with the concerns and aspirations of people in the 21st century. As they prepared to leave Balmoral and return to London, Catherine took one last look at the castle. She thought about all the history these walls had witnessed, all the decisions that had been made within them that had shaped the course of nations. Soon, she and William would be making those kinds of decisions. Soon, they would be the ones carrying the weight of the crown, literally and figuratively. The journey back to London was different from their frantic race to Scotland the day before. Now they traveled in an official convoy, with police escorts and security details that befitted their new status. As they crossed from Scotland into England, Catherine noticed the crowds gathering along the roadside. People held flowers and signs. Many were crying. All were there to pay their respects to the Queen and to catch a glimpse of the future King and Queen. "Look at them," Catherine said softly to William. "They're looking to us now. They're looking for reassurance, for continuity, for hope." William followed her gaze to the crowds, seeing faces both young and old, people from all walks of life united in their grief for the Queen and their uncertainty about what came next. "We won't let them down," William replied. And Catherine could hear the determination in his voice. This was the moment when the boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, who had struggled with the pressures of royal life, who had once seemed reluctant to embrace his destiny, finally stepped fully into his role as the future king. When they arrived in London, the city felt different. Black banners hung from government buildings, church bells tolled solemnly across the capital, and crowds lined the streets leading to Buckingham Palace. The palace itself was a sea of flowers as people from around the world brought tributes to the Queen. The gates were covered with messages of love and condolence, pictures of the Queen from throughout her long reign, and children's drawings showing her with her beloved corgis. William and Catherine's first public appearance as the new Prince and Princess of Wales would come the next day. But as they stood at the windows of their apartment in Kensington Palace that evening, looking out at the crowds gathered below, they both knew that everything had changed forever. They were no longer just William and Catherine, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. They were the future King and Queen of the United Kingdom, and the weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and inspiring. That night, as they put their 3 children to bed, George, Charlotte, and Louis asked questions about their great-grandmother, about what would happen next, about what this all meant for their family. William and Catherine did their best to explain, in terms that young children could understand, that Gangan, as the children called the Queen, had gone to heaven, and that Grandpa Charles was now the king. "Does that mean Daddy will be king someday?" Charlotte asked with the directness that only children possess. William knelt down to look his daughter in the eye, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, sweetheart, someday Daddy will be king, and Mummy will be queen, and you, and George, and Louis will help us take care of everyone in the country." The children seemed to accept this with the resilience of youth, but William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke volumes about the conversation they would need to have about how this would change their children's lives. Later that evening, alone in their bedroom, William and Catherine finally had a moment to process what had happened. The woman who had been the steady center of William's world since his birth was gone. The grandmother who had guided him through the trauma of losing his mother, who had taught him what it meant to serve others, who had shown him how to carry the weight of the crown with grace and dignity, would no longer be there to offer advice and support. "I keep thinking about what she said," Catherine told him as they sat together in the quiet darkness. "About taking care of you. Taking care of everyone. I know she meant the family, but I think she meant more than that. I think she meant the country, the Commonwealth, all the people who will look to us for leadership." William nodded, understanding exactly what Catherine meant. The Queen had not just been asking Catherine to care for her grandson. She had been passing on a sacred trust, a responsibility to serve others that went far beyond personal relationships or family obligations. It was a charge to use their positions, their platform, their influence to make a positive difference in the world. "We'll do it together," William said, taking Catherine's hand in the same way he had during their wedding ceremony 11 years earlier. "Whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together." And in that moment, in the quiet of their bedroom while London mourned outside their windows, the future King and Queen of the United Kingdom made a silent vow to honor the memory of Queen Elizabeth II by serving with the same dedication, the same sense of duty, and the same unwavering commitment to others that had defined her remarkable reign. The next morning would bring their first public appearance as the Prince and Princess of Wales. But tonight they held each other close and prepared to step into a destiny that would change not just their lives, but the lives of millions of people around the world who would look to them for guidance, inspiration, and hope in the years to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as William and Catherine prepared for what would be their first public appearance as the new Prince and Princess of Wales. The date was September 10th, 2022, just 2 days after Queen Elizabeth II had passed away at Balmoral, and the world was watching to see how the future King and Queen would handle this moment of transition. Catherine stood before the mirror in their private quarters, adjusting the simple black dress she had chosen for the occasion. Every detail mattered now, more than it ever had before. As the new Princess of Wales, she carried not just her own reputation, but the weight of a title that had belonged to William's beloved mother, Diana. The comparison was inevitable, and Catherine knew that every gesture, every expression, every choice of clothing would be scrutinized and analyzed by media outlets around the globe. William was in the adjacent room, receiving a final briefing from his private secretary about the day's schedule. They would be meeting with King Charles III first, then traveling to Windsor Castle where they would greet members of the public who had gathered to pay their respects to the Queen. It would be a carefully choreographed event, but one that needed to feel genuine and spontaneous. The British people were grieving, and they needed to see that their future monarchs understood and shared that grief. The irony was not lost on either of them that their first major public appearance would be at Windsor Castle, the place where they had made their home for the past few years. This was where their children played in the gardens, where they had enjoyed quiet family dinners away from the public eye, where they had found some semblance of normal family life despite the extraordinary circumstances of their position. Now, even this sanctuary would be transformed into a stage for royal duty. As they prepared to leave Kensington Palace, Catherine caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different from the person she had been just 2 days earlier. There was a new gravity in her expression, a weight in her eyes that spoke of the magnitude of what lay ahead. She was no longer just Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, a senior royal who supported various charities and causes. She was now Catherine, the Princess of Wales, the future Queen of the United Kingdom. The drive to Windsor was made in relative silence. Both William and Catherine were lost in their own thoughts, preparing mentally for what lay ahead. They had done countless public engagements over the years, had met with thousands of people, had spoken at dozens of events, but this felt different. This was their debut as the heir to the throne and his wife. Their first chance to show the country and the world what kind of leaders they would be. As their motorcade approached Windsor Castle, they could see the crowds that had gathered. Hundreds of people lined the streets leading to the castle gates, many holding flowers, others simply there to catch a glimpse of the future king and queen. There were elderly couples who remembered the queen's coronation in 1953, middle-aged parents who had grown up during her reign, and young children who had known no other monarch. All of them were there to say goodbye to the only queen most of them had ever known, and to see the people who would one day take her place. King Charles III was waiting for them at the castle, and the meeting between father and son was both formal and deeply personal. Charles had been waiting his entire life to become king, and now that the moment had arrived, it came wrapped in the profound grief of losing his mother. He looked older than he had just days before, the weight of the crown already visible in his bearing and expression. "Are you ready for this?" Charles asked William, referring not just to the public appearance they were about to make, but to everything that lay ahead. The question carried decades of preparation, of training, of gradual assumption of royal duties, all leading to this moment. William straightened his shoulders, and Catherine saw in that gesture the transformation from grieving grandson to future king. "Yes, sir," he replied. And in those simple words was a lifetime of understanding about duty, service, and sacrifice. The three of them walked together toward the castle gates where the crowds were waiting. As they emerged into public view for the first time since the Queen's death, a hush fell over the assembled masses. Here was the living embodiment of continuity, the proof that the monarchy would continue, that the institution the Queen had devoted her life to would survive her passing. Catherine was struck by the silence that greeted them. She had expected noise, questions from reporters, the usual chaos that accompanied royal appearances. Instead, there was a reverent quiet, broken only by the sound of cameras clicking and the occasional sob from someone in the crowd. The British people were seeing their future queen for the first time, and the moment felt almost sacred. They began walking along the barriers that had been set up to separate the royal family from the public, stopping to accept flowers, to shake hands, to offer words of comfort to those who had come to pay their respects. Catherine found herself face to face with an elderly woman who was crying openly, clutching a photograph of the Queen from her younger days. "She was everything to us," the woman said through her tears. "How will we go on without her?" Catherine took the woman's hands in her own, feeling the weight of the question. How do you comfort an entire nation? How do you help people process the loss of someone who had been a constant presence in their lives for over 7 decades? "She would want us to go on," Catherine replied softly. "She would want us to carry forward the values she lived by, the service she gave, the love she showed for this country. That's how we honor her memory." The woman nodded, seeming to find some comfort in Catherine's words, and pressed the photograph into her hands. "For you to remember her," she said. Catherine accepted the photograph with a solemnity that made it clear she understood the significance of the gesture. This was not just a picture. It was a sacred trust, a piece of history being passed from one generation to another. As they continued along the barrier, William found himself in conversation with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The child had drawn a picture of the Queen with her corgis, and he shyly offered it to the Prince of Wales. "Did you know the Queen?" the boy asked with the innocent curiosity of childhood. William knelt down to the boy's level, bringing himself to eye height with the child. "She was my granny," he said simply. "She was very kind, and she loved children very much." She would have loved your picture." The boy's eyes widened with understanding and sympathy that seemed far beyond his years. "I'm sorry your granny died," he said. And in that moment, William felt the full weight of his dual identity. He was both a grandson grieving the loss of a beloved family member and a future king accepting condolences from his future subjects. "Thank you," William replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to me." The interaction was captured by dozens of cameras, and the image of the future king kneeling to speak with a child would become one of the defining photographs of that historic day. It showed a man who understood that being royal was not about standing above others, but about connecting with them, about sharing in their joys and sorrows, about being genuinely present in moments of both celebration and grief. Catherine, meanwhile, had moved further along the barrier and was speaking with a group of teenage girls who had skipped school to be there. They were crying not just for the Queen, but for what her death represented: the end of an era, the uncertainty of what came next, the recognition that they were witnessing history in real time. "We don't know what to do," one of the girls confided. "She's been the Queen our whole lives. It feels like the world is ending." Even though she had known this day would come, even though the royal family had prepared for it, the reality of the Queen's absence felt surreal and overwhelming. But as the future Queen, she knew she had a responsibility to offer hope, to help these young people see that endings could also be beginnings. "I know it feels scary," Catherine told them. "Change always does." But the Queen spent 70 years building something strong and lasting. She created institutions and traditions and values that will continue long after any of us are gone. Her legacy lives on in all of us. The girls seemed to draw strength from Catherine's words, and she could see them standing a little taller, wiping away their tears, and looking toward the future with something that might have been hope. This was what the Queen had meant when she told Catherine to take care of everyone. It wasn't just about the royal family. It was about the entire nation, about helping millions of people navigate through uncertainty and grief toward a future that honored the past while embracing change. As the walkabout continued, more and more people pressed forward to catch a glimpse of William and Catherine. There were veterans who had served during the Queen's reign, immigrants who had found new lives in Britain, teachers and nurses and shopkeepers and students, people from every walk of life who had come to say goodbye to their Queen and to see their future king and queen. One particularly moving moment came when Catherine encountered a woman in her 90s who had served as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen during the early years of her reign. The woman was in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets against the September chill, but her eyes were bright and alert. "I knew her when she was young," the woman told Catherine. "She was so beautiful, so determined to do right by everyone. You remind me of her." The comparison took Catherine's breath away. To be compared to Queen Elizabeth II, even by someone who had known her personally, felt like both an incredible honor and an overwhelming responsibility. The Queen had set a standard of service and dedication that would be almost impossible to match, but Catherine understood that this was exactly what would be expected of her. "I hope I can live up to her example," Catherine replied, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. "You will," the elderly woman said with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of experience. "I can see it in you." The Queen could see it too. That's why she was never worried about the future of the monarchy. She knew it would be in good hands. These words stayed with Catherine as they continued their walk. The idea that the Queen had confidence in her, had seen something in her that made her believe the monarchy would be safe in her hands, was both comforting and terrifying. It meant that all the years of training, all the gradual assumption of royal duties, all the careful preparation had been leading to this moment, when she would need to step forward and help lead a nation through one of its most significant transitions. William, too, was having his own profound encounters with the public. He spoke with Commonwealth veterans who had served in conflicts around the world, with young entrepreneurs who were building businesses and creating jobs, with environmental activists who shared his passion for conservation. Each conversation reminded him that being king would mean being responsible for all of these people, for their hopes and dreams and fears. As the afternoon wore on, the informal nature of the walkabout began to feel more natural. William and Catherine found their rhythm, moving smoothly from person to person, offering comfort where it was needed, listening to stories and concerns, accepting flowers and gifts and photographs. They were no longer just performing their first public duty as Prince and Princess of Wales. They were connecting with the people they would one day serve as King and Queen. The media coverage of the event was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. News outlets around the world reported on the grace and compassion William and Catherine had shown, on their ability to connect with people from all backgrounds, on the hope they had offered during a time of national mourning. The images from that day: William kneeling to speak with the young boy, Catherine accepting the photograph from the elderly woman, both of them genuinely listening to the concerns and stories of ordinary people, would become iconic representations of their approach to royal duty. But perhaps the most significant moment of the day came near the end of their walkabout, when they encountered a group of Commonwealth representatives who had come to Windsor to pay their respects to the Queen. Here were people from Canada and Australia, from Jamaica and New Zealand, from countries across Africa and Asia that had been part of the Queen's realm. They represented the global nature of the modern monarchy. The fact that William and Catherine would not just be king and queen of the United Kingdom, but heads of state for millions of people around the world. A young woman from Ghana spoke for the group, expressing their condolences and their hope for the future. "The Queen was a mother to all of us," she said. "She showed us that leadership is about service, that power is about helping others. We hope you will continue that tradition." William felt the weight of that responsibility in a new way. He had always understood intellectually that he would one day be king of multiple nations, but standing there looking into the faces of people from around the world who were looking to him for leadership, the reality of that global responsibility became clear. This was not just about being king of the United Kingdom. This was about being a symbol of unity and stability for the Commonwealth, for countries and cultures that spanned the globe. "We will," he promised, and Catherine nodded beside him. "The Queen showed us what it means to serve others, to put duty before self, to work for the common good. That's the example we will follow." As they prepared to leave Windsor Castle, William and Catherine took a moment to look back at the crowds that had gathered. Thousands of people had come to be part of this historic moment, to witness the first public appearance of their future king and queen. The flowers and tributes to the Queen covered nearly every available surface, creating a sea of color and emotion that spoke to the depth of feeling for the woman who had died and the hope for the future she had left behind. "They're counting on us," Catherine said softly, and William could hear both the weight and the wonder in her voice. "Yes," William replied, "and we won't let them down." As their motorcade pulled away from Windsor Castle, both William and Catherine knew that they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just preparing to be king and queen someday in the distant future. They were now actively filling those roles, carrying the hopes and expectations of millions of people, representing continuity and change, tradition and progress, all at the same time. The walkabout at Windsor had been their first test, and they had passed it with grace and dignity that honored both the memory of the Queen and the promise of their own future reign. The days following the Windsor walkabout were a whirlwind of preparation for Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, an event that would bring together world leaders, dignitaries, and millions of mourners from around the globe. For William and Catherine, these days represented not just a time of personal grief, but their final preparation before stepping onto the world stage as the future king and queen of the United Kingdom. Westminster Abbey had been the setting for royal ceremonies for nearly 1,000 years, but never had it hosted an event quite like this. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II would be watched by an estimated 4 billion people worldwide, making it one of the most viewed events in human history. Inside the ancient walls where kings and queens had been crowned, married, and laid to rest for centuries, William and Catherine would take their place in the front row of history. The morning of September 19, 2022, dawned crisp and clear in London. Catherine stood in her dressing room at Kensington Palace, holding the black coat dress she had chosen for the funeral. It was elegant but understated, appropriate for mourning, but dignified enough for her new status as Princess of Wales. She had spent weeks considering every detail, knowing that her appearance would be scrutinized by millions of viewers around the world. As she dressed, Catherine thought about the last conversation she had had with the Queen, just months before her death. They had been at a family gathering, and the Queen had pulled her aside to speak privately. "You know," the Queen had said in her gentle but firm way, "being royal is not about the title or the jewels or the palaces. It's about understanding that every day you have the opportunity to make someone's life a little bit better. That's the real crown we wear." Those words had stayed with Catherine, and now, as she prepared for the Queen's funeral, she understood them in a deeper way. The real test of her worthiness to be queen would not be how she looked or spoke in public, but how she used her position to serve others, to bring hope and healing to people who needed it most. William was in his own quarters, being helped into his military uniform by his valet. As a working member of the royal family and a former military officer, he had the right to wear his dress uniform to the funeral. But every ribbon and medal carried weight and meaning. This was not just ceremonial dress. It was a symbol of his service to his country and his preparation for the ultimate service he would one day provide as king. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, would also attend the funeral, a decision that had required careful consideration. At 9 years old, George was old enough to understand the gravity of the occasion and his future role as second in line to the throne after his father. Charlotte at 7 was curious and compassionate, often asking thoughtful questions about what was happening. 4-year-old Louis was still very young, but the family felt it was important for all 3 children to say goodbye to their great-grandmother and to begin understanding their place in the continuity of the monarchy. The journey from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was made in solemn procession. William and Catherine traveled with the children in a state car, part of a carefully orchestrated series of movements that had been planned months in advance. As they drove through the streets of London, they could see thousands of people lining the route, many having camped overnight to secure their spots. Some held flowers, others held photographs of the Queen. All stood in respectful silence as the funeral cortege passed by. Catherine looked out at the crowds and was struck by the diversity of faces she saw. There were elderly people who had lived through the entire 70 years of the Queen's reign, immigrants who had found new homes in Britain during her time on the throne, young families with children who would grow up knowing King Charles III and eventually King William V. These were the people she and William would one day serve. The faces that reminded her that the monarchy was not about ceremony and tradition for its own sake, but about service to real people with real lives and real needs. Westminster Abbey was already filled to capacity when their car arrived. Inside were kings and queens from around the world, presidents and prime ministers, religious leaders and diplomats. It was a gathering unlike any other in modern history, brought together by respect for a woman who had dedicated her life to service and duty. But for William and Catherine, walking into that ancient church was about more than attending a state funeral. It was about taking their place in a story that stretched back centuries and would continue long after they were gone. As they entered the abbey, Catherine was struck by the weight of history contained within those walls. Here was where the Queen had been crowned in 1953, where William and Catherine themselves had been married in 2011, where countless royal ceremonies had marked the great moments of British history. Now it would be where they said farewell to the woman who had been the steady center of that history for over 7 decades. They took their seats in the front row, with King Charles III and Queen Camilla beside them. Behind them sat other members of the royal family, and behind them the representatives of nations from around the world. Catherine felt the eyes of billions of people on her. But more than that, she felt the responsibility of representing not just herself or even the royal family, but the grief and hopes of an entire nation. The funeral service was a masterpiece of solemnity and celebration, mourning and thanksgiving. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke of the Queen's faith and service, her dedication to duty and her love for her people. The hymns chosen were those that had marked important moments in the Queen's life, including "The Lord's My Shepherd," which had been sung at her wedding to Prince Philip over 70 years earlier. But for William and Catherine, the most moving moment came when the Dean of Westminster read from the Gospel of John, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?" These were words about hope, about continuity, about the belief that endings are also beginnings. They spoke not just to the Christian faith that had sustained the Queen throughout her life, but to the idea that her legacy would continue in the work of those who came after her. During the service, Catherine found her mind drifting to the future. Someday she and William would be the ones sitting in the throne chairs at state occasions. Someday their children would be in the positions now occupied by William and his siblings. Someday, far in the future, there would be another funeral like this one, and the cycle of monarchy would continue. The thought was both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because of the enormous responsibility it represented, inspiring because of the opportunity it provided to serve something greater than themselves. When the service ended, the Queen's coffin was carried out of the abbey on the shoulders of her guards. the same men who had protected her in life now carrying her to her final rest. The procession to Windsor Castle would be the Queen's last journey through the streets of London, and William and Catherine would be part of the cortege that accompanied her. The drive from Westminster to Windsor took them through the heart of London and out into the countryside beyond. All along the route, people stood in respectful silence, many throwing flowers as the hearse passed by. It was a remarkable demonstration of affection and respect for the Queen, but also a recognition of the end of an era and the beginning of something new. At Windsor Castle, the Queen would be laid to rest in St. George's Chapel beside her husband, Prince Philip, who had died the year before. The chapel was the same place where William and Catherine had attended the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in 2018, where they had celebrated family occasions and royal milestones. Now it would be where they said their final goodbye to the woman who had been the anchor of the royal family. The burial service was private, attended only by close family members. Here, away from the cameras and the crowds, William and Catherine could finally grieve as grandson and granddaughter-in-law, rather than as public figures. Catherine watched as William stood beside his father and siblings, supporting each other in their shared loss. This was the private side of royal life, the human emotions that existed behind the public ceremonies and official duties. As the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault, Catherine thought about the conversations she had had with her over the years. The Queen had been a mentor and guide, someone who understood the unique pressures and challenges of royal life because she had lived them herself. She had taught Catherine about the importance of duty without losing sight of joy, about serving others while maintaining your own sense of self, about being royal without losing touch with the real world. "She'll be missed," William said softly as they walked away from the chapel, and Catherine could hear the depth of his grief in those simple words. The Queen had not just been his sovereign, she had been his grandmother, the one who had helped him through the darkest periods of his life, who had guided him toward his destiny as king. "But she'll also be remembered," Catherine replied, taking his hand. "Everything she taught us, everything she stood for, will continue in what we do." The days that followed the funeral were a period of adjustment and reflection. The new royal hierarchy was still settling into place, with King Charles III at the top, William and Catherine as heir and future queen, and the rest of the family finding their new positions in the changed landscape of the monarchy. It was a time of both mourning and planning, of honoring the past while preparing for the future. For William and Catherine, the funeral had been a powerful reminder of what they were inheriting. The ceremony had shown them the global reach of the monarchy, the way that British royalty could bring together people from around the world, in shared purpose and common cause. They had seen world leaders who commanded armies and economies stand in respectful silence for a woman whose power came not from force or wealth, but from decades of faithful service. They had also seen the deep affection that ordinary people felt for the royal family when it lived up to its highest ideals. The millions of people who had lined the streets, who had watched the funeral on television, who had sent flowers and messages of condolence, were not just mourning the death of a monarch, they were expressing their hope that the institution of monarchy could continue to provide stability, continuity, and moral leadership in an uncertain world. In the weeks following the funeral, William and Catherine began to settle into their new roles more fully. They started using their new titles, the Prince and Princess of Wales, in official communications. They began taking on patronages and causes that reflected their new status as the senior working royals below the King and Queen. Most importantly, they began to develop their own vision for what the monarchy could be in the 21st century. Their approach was subtly different from what had come before. While maintaining the dignity and tradition that had defined the Queen's reign, they brought a more informal touch to their engagements, a greater willingness to connect directly with people from all backgrounds, a focus on causes that spoke to the challenges and opportunities of their generation. Catherine, in particular, began to carve out her own identity as Princess of Wales. She had spent years as the Duchess of Cambridge building expertise in early childhood development, mental health, and the arts. Now, with her elevated platform, she could expand that work and reach even more people. She understood that being Princess of Wales meant more than just supporting her husband. It meant being a leader in her own right, someone who could use her position to make a real difference in people's lives. William, meanwhile, was grappling with the reality that he was now the heir apparent, the man who would one day be king. The theoretical future had suddenly become much more immediate and real. He found himself thinking differently about his engagements and causes, considering not just their current impact, but how they would prepare him for the ultimate responsibility of kingship. Their children, too, were adjusting to their new positions. George, in particular, seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. He was now second in line to the throne, the little boy who would one day be King William VI. His parents worked to help him understand this responsibility gradually, in age-appropriate ways that wouldn't overwhelm him but would prepare him for the life that lay ahead. The transformation was not just personal but professional. Their offices were reorganized to reflect their new status, their schedules expanded to include more significant engagements, their international profile raised to match their position as the future king and queen. Every aspect of their lives was touched by the change that had occurred with the Queen's death and their elevation to Prince and Princess of Wales. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they saw themselves and their mission. The Queen's funeral had shown them the power of the monarchy to unite people, to provide comfort in times of grief, to represent the best of human values and aspirations. They had seen how much people needed something to believe in, something that represented continuity and hope in a rapidly changing world. As autumn turned to winter in 2022, William and Catherine began to understand that they were no longer just members of the royal family. They were the future of the monarchy itself, the people who would determine whether this ancient institution could adapt and survive in the modern world. The Queen's death had ended one chapter of British history, but it had also begun another, and they were the authors of that new chapter. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II had been their first major test as Prince and Princess of Wales, and they had passed it with dignity and grace, but they both understood that it was just the beginning. Ahead of them lay years of preparation, of learning, of gradually taking on more responsibility until the day when they would wear the crown themselves. The weight of that future was both daunting and inspiring, a responsibility that would define not just their own lives, but the lives of their children and the nation they would one day serve as king and queen. 6 months after Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, the world was still adjusting to the new royal order, but nowhere was this more evident than in the careful preparation for King Charles III's coronation. This would be the moment when the new monarchy would truly be revealed to the world, and for William and Catherine, it represented another crucial step in their journey toward the throne. The coronation was scheduled for May 6, 2023, at Westminster Abbey, the same ancient church where the Queen had been crowned 70 years earlier, and where she had been laid to rest just months before. But this ceremony would be different from its predecessor. Smaller, more modern, more reflective of 21st century Britain. Charles had been planning this event for decades, and it would showcase his vision for a streamlined, more accessible monarchy. For William and Catherine, the coronation preparations offered a unique window into their own future. They would play central roles in the ceremony, not just as supporters of the new king, but as the heirs who would one day go through this same ritual themselves. Every detail they observed, every tradition they participated in, would inform their understanding of what it meant to wear the crown. The months leading up to the coronation were filled with intense preparation. Catherine found herself working with designers on her coronation outfit, a process that required balancing tradition with personal style, formality with accessibility. Every choice would be interpreted and analyzed by fashion experts and royal watchers around the world. More importantly, she wanted her appearance to reflect the values she hoped to embody as Princess of Wales: elegance without ostentation, respect for tradition without being trapped by it. William was deeply involved in the planning of the ceremony itself. As heir to the throne, he would play a crucial role in the service, and he wanted to ensure that it struck the right balance between honoring ancient traditions and speaking to modern audiences. He spent hours with the Archbishop of Canterbury and other church officials, discussing the meaning behind each element of the coronation service, understanding the symbolism that would one day apply to his own crowning. The children were also being prepared for their roles in the ceremony. George, at 9 years old, would serve as one of his grandfather's pages of honor, a position that would place him at the heart of the coronation service. It was a significant responsibility for such a young boy, but it was also an important step in his preparation for his own future role as king. Charlotte and Louis would attend as members of the royal family, continuing their gradual introduction to the public ceremonies that would define their lives. As the coronation day approached, William and Catherine found themselves reflecting on how much had changed since the Queen's death. They had grown more comfortable with their new titles and responsibilities, more confident in their public roles, more certain about their vision for the future of the monarchy. The intensive months of preparation had been like a master class in kingship and queenship, taught by the pressure of constant public attention and the weight of enormous expectation. The morning of the coronation dawned bright and clear in London. Catherine stood before her mirror for what felt like the 100th time, but this time it was for the real event. Her outfit had been chosen with extraordinary care. An ivory silk crepe dress by Alexander McQueen, the same designer who had created her wedding dress 12 years earlier. The choice was deliberate, connecting this moment to her marriage and her entry into the royal family. Over the dress, she wore a navy blue and red ceremonial robe, with gold embroidery that caught the light as she moved. The most significant element of her outfit was her headpiece, a smaller version of a traditional royal crown, designed specifically for this occasion. It was made of silver and diamonds, with elements that referenced both British history and her own Welsh heritage as Princess of Wales. Wearing it, Catherine felt the literal weight of her position, but also the symbolic weight of representing millions of people around the world. William wore the ceremonial dress uniform of the Welsh Guards, with a blue velvet mantle over it. As heir to the throne, he would walk immediately behind his father in the coronation procession, symbolically showing his place in the line of succession. The uniform had been worn by previous heirs at previous coronations, connecting him to generations of princes who had prepared for kingship by supporting their predecessors. The journey to Westminster Abbey was made in the magnificent gold state coach, the same carriage that had carried the Queen to her coronation and that would one day carry William and Catherine to theirs. The coach dated back to 1762 and was ornately decorated with painted panels depicting Roman gods and goddesses, symbols of the divine nature of kingship that stretched back through centuries of British history. As they rode through the streets of London, Catherine was amazed by the crowds that had gathered. Despite early concerns about public enthusiasm for the new king, hundreds of thousands of people lined the coronation route, many having camped out overnight to secure good viewing positions. There were Union Jack flags everywhere, but also flags from Commonwealth nations around the world, showing the global nature of the occasion. The diversity of the crowds was striking. There were elderly people who remembered the Queen's coronation, middle-aged royal enthusiasts who had followed the family for decades, and young families with children who were experiencing their first major royal event. Many held signs expressing support for King Charles III, but Catherine also noticed signs welcoming her and William to their new roles, showing that the public was excited about the future of the monarchy as well as celebrating its present. Westminster Abbey had been transformed for the coronation. The ancient stone walls were decorated with flowers and banners, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and celebratory. 2,000 guests filled the Abbey, including world leaders, representatives from Commonwealth nations, members of European royal families, and invited guests from across British society. It was a gathering that represented the global reach and diverse nature of modern Britain. As they entered the Abbey, William and Catherine took their places near the front, with the best view of the ceremony that would unfold. They were seated with their children and other senior members of the royal family, but their positioning made clear their special status as the immediate heirs to the throne. Every camera in the Abbey seemed trained on them as much as on the king, recognizing that they represented the future of the institution being celebrated. The coronation service itself was a masterpiece of ancient ritual and modern adaptation. The ceremony followed traditions that dated back over 1,000 years, but it also included contemporary elements that spoke to 21st century Britain. The music included both classical pieces that had been performed at previous coronations and modern compositions that reflected the king's personal interests and the changing nature of British society. For Catherine, one of the most moving moments came when King Charles III took his coronation oath, promising to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth according to law and justice, to mercy and truth. These were words that she and William would one day speak themselves, and hearing them in the sacred atmosphere of Westminster Abbey brought home the magnitude of the commitment they would eventually make. the moment when the Archbishop of Canterbury placed St. C.P. Edward's crown on Charles's head was electric. This was the same crown that had been used to crown monarchs for over 300 years, a symbol of continuity that connected the new king to all his predecessors. As the crown was lowered onto his head, Charles became not just king in name, but king in the fullest ceremonial and spiritual sense. William felt a complex mix of emotions watching his father being crowned. Pride in seeing Charles finally achieve the destiny he had prepared for his entire life. Sadness that the Queen was not there to see her son's greatest moment. And anticipation, knowing that one day he would be sitting in that same chair, wearing that same crown, making those same promises to serve and protect his people. The moment when the congregation shouted, "God save the King," was overwhelming. The sound echoed through the abbey and seemed to symbolize the acceptance of the new monarch by his people. But Catherine noticed that many of the voices seemed to be looking toward her and William as they shouted, as if they were already thinking ahead to the next coronation, the next chapter in the story of the British monarchy. George's performance as a page of honor was flawless despite his young age. He carried his grandfather's robes with dignity and seriousness that impressed everyone present. Watching him, Catherine could see glimpses of the future king he would one day become, just as she could see in William echoes of the great kings of the past. The ceremony was not just about crowning Charles. It was about celebrating the continuity of the institution and the promise of its future. After the ceremony, the newly crowned king and queen emerged from Westminster Abbey to thunderous cheers from the crowd. William and Catherine followed close behind, and the reception they received was almost as enthusiastic as that given to the new monarchs. The crowd seemed to recognize that they were seeing not just the coronation of a new king, but the presentation of the future of the monarchy. The procession back to Buckingham Palace was spectacular. The gold state coach carried the newly crowned king and queen, followed by other members of the royal family, in a series of magnificent carriages. The streets were lined with people waving flags and cheering, creating an atmosphere of celebration that contradicted predictions that the coronation would be a subdued affair. For William and Catherine, riding through the streets of London in their own carriage, the moment was a preview of their own future. These same streets, these same cheering crowds, this same atmosphere of celebration and expectation would greet them on their own coronation day. The thought was both thrilling and sobering, a reminder of the joy and burden that came with their position. At Buckingham Palace, the traditional balcony appearance drew enormous crowds to the mall. The newly crowned king and queen appeared with the immediate royal family, including William, Catherine, and their children. The sight of 3 generations of the royal family together on the balcony, the new king, the heir, and the future heirs, was powerful symbolism of the monarchy's continuity and future. The flypast by the Royal Air Force was magnificent, with historic aircraft followed by modern fighters and transport planes. As the planes roared overhead, Catherine found herself thinking about all the technological and social changes the monarchy had witnessed over the centuries, and all the changes it would need to navigate in the years to come. The evening brought a star-studded concert at Windsor Castle, featuring some of the world's biggest musical acts performing for the royal family and invited guests. The concert was broadcast around the world and showed a more relaxed, contemporary side of the royal family. William and Catherine were seen laughing and enjoying themselves, showing that they could balance the dignity of their positions with genuine enjoyment of life. But perhaps the most significant moment of the coronation weekend came during a private family dinner at Clarence House. Away from the cameras and crowds, 3 generations of the royal family gathered to celebrate Charles's coronation and to discuss the future. Charles, now wearing the crown both literally and figuratively, spoke about his hopes for his reign and his confidence in William and Catherine as his successors. "Today was about honoring the past," Charles said, looking around the table at his family, "but tomorrow is about building the future. And I couldn't be more confident about leaving that future in your hands." William and Catherine exchanged a look across the table, both understanding that this was more than a father expressing pride in his son. This was a king acknowledging his heirs and expressing confidence in their ability to carry forward the work he had begun. It was a passing of the torch that would not be complete for many years, but that had begun in earnest with the coronation. The weeks following the coronation saw a notable shift in how William and Catherine were perceived by the public and the media. their prominent roles in the ceremony, their obvious comfort with the grandeur and responsibility of royal life, and their clear chemistry as a couple had impressed observers around the world. They were no longer just the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge who happened to be next in line. They were the Prince and Princess of Wales, who were clearly ready for greater responsibility. International media coverage of the coronation had focused heavily on William and Catherine, with many outlets describing them as the crown jewels of the British monarchy. Their youth, their apparent happiness, their growing confidence in their roles, and their obvious love for their children made them compelling figures on the world stage. Foreign dignitaries who had attended the coronation reported back to their own governments that the future of the British monarchy looked secure and dynamic. For Catherine, the coronation had been a masterclass in queenship. She had watched Queen Camilla navigate the ceremony with grace and dignity, had observed how she balanced tradition with personal style, had seen how she supported her husband while maintaining her own identity. These were all lessons that Catherine would need to apply when her own time came to wear the crown. The coronation had also been an important moment for their children. George's successful performance as a page of honor had given him confidence in his ability to handle royal responsibilities. Charlotte and Louis had behaved impeccably during the long ceremony, showing that they were growing up to understand their positions and responsibilities. For a family that tried to maintain as normal a life as possible, the coronation had been a reminder that their lives would always be shaped by their royal destiny. As spring turned to summer in 2023, William and Catherine found themselves looking forward with greater confidence and clarity than they had ever felt before. The coronation had marked not just the beginning of King Charles III's reign, but their own final preparation for the crown. They had seen how the ancient rituals and traditions could be adapted for modern times, how the monarchy could honor its past while embracing its future. Most importantly, they had felt the support and enthusiasm of the British people and the Commonwealth, the crowds that had cheered them during the coronation, the positive media coverage they had received, the confidence expressed by world leaders. All of this had shown them that when their time came to serve as king and queen, they would not be alone. They would have the support of millions of people who believed in the institution of monarchy and in their ability to lead it into a new era. 2 years after King Charles III's coronation, in the spring of 25, William and Catherine faced what would become their most defining moment as the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was not a planned ceremony or celebration, but a crisis that would test everything they had learned about leadership, service, and the true meaning of monarchy. The crisis began with a series of devastating floods across northern England and Scotland, the worst natural disaster to hit the United Kingdom in generations. Climate change had intensified the storm systems moving across the Atlantic, and when they met the unique geography of the British Isles, the results were catastrophic. Entire communities were cut off by rising waters, thousands of homes were destroyed, and dozens of people lost their lives. William and Catherine were at Anmere Hall in Norfolk when the first reports came in. They had been enjoying a rare, quiet weekend with their children, playing in the gardens and having a normal family life away from the pressures of royal duty. But as the television news showed images of the devastation, families stranded on rooftops, rescue workers risking their lives to save others, entire towns disappearing under brown floodwaters, they knew their weekend was over. The phone call from King Charles III's office came within hours. The king himself was dealing with a minor health issue, and his doctors had advised against travel to the affected areas. This meant that William and Catherine would need to lead the royal family's response to the crisis, to be the visible symbols of support and hope that the British people would need in their darkest hour. "Are you ready for this?" William asked Catherine as they prepared to leave Norfolk for the flood zones. It was a question that carried more weight than just the immediate crisis. This would be their first time leading the monarchy's response to a major national emergency, their first chance to show that they could provide the kind of steady, reassuring leadership that the Queen had provided during the Blitz, during the Falklands War, during the dark days after Princess Diana's death. "We have to be," Catherine replied, and in those 4 words was a lifetime of preparation, a decade of royal training, and the understanding that being royal meant putting the needs of others before your own comfort or convenience. They traveled first to Yorkshire, where some of the worst flooding had occurred. The ancient market town of Tadcaster was completely cut off by floodwaters, its famous brewery submerged, its residents evacuated to emergency shelters in nearby Leeds. This was where William and Catherine would make their first appearance, and the images from that visit would define how the crisis was remembered. They arrived by helicopter, the only way to reach the area safely, and were immediately struck by the scale of the devastation. The normally charming Yorkshire countryside looked like a vast lake, with only the tops of trees and the roofs of houses visible above the brown water. Emergency vehicles lined the roads that were still passable, and the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as rescue operations continued around the clock. Their first stop was at an evacuation center that had been set up in a local school. Hundreds of people who had lost everything were sheltering there, sleeping on cots, eating emergency rations, trying to process the reality that their homes and communities had been destroyed. When William and Catherine walked through the doors, the reaction was immediate and powerful. These were not royal watchers or monarchists who had come to see them. These were ordinary people in the worst crisis of their lives, people who had more pressing concerns than royal protocol or ceremony. But when they saw the Prince and Princess of Wales walking among them, taking time to speak with each family, listening to their stories and offering comfort, something shifted in the atmosphere of the shelter. Catherine knelt down beside an elderly woman who was clutching a photograph of her flooded home. The woman was crying, overwhelmed by the loss of everything she had built over a lifetime. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she told Catherine. "Everything's gone. 70 years of memories just washed away." Catherine took the woman's hands in her own and looked directly into her eyes. "I can't imagine how hard this must be," she said, "but you're not alone. We're going to help you rebuild. And your memories aren't gone. They're right here in your heart, and no flood can touch them." The conversation was captured by the media, but more importantly, it was witnessed by everyone else in the shelter. They saw their future queen not just making polite conversation, but genuinely connecting with someone in pain, offering not just words, but real comfort and hope. It was exactly the kind of moment the queen would have created, but it was uniquely Catherine's own. William, meanwhile, was speaking with the emergency responders, who had been working around the clock to save lives and coordinate the relief effort. These were police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and volunteers who had been putting themselves at risk to help others. They were exhausted, stressed, and dealing with a situation that was beyond anything they had trained for. "What do you need?" William asked the incident commander, a question that surprised the man. He had expected polite conversation and photo opportunities, not a serious inquiry about operational needs. "Honestly, sir, we need more boats for the rescue operations, and we need better coordination between the different agencies," the commander replied, testing whether the prince was genuinely interested in helping or just going through the motions. William pulled out his phone and made a series of calls, using his connections and influence to expedite the delivery of additional rescue equipment and to ensure better communication between the different organizations involved in the relief effort. Within hours, additional resources were flowing into the affected areas, and the rescue operations were running more smoothly. This was a side of royal duty that most people never saw. Not the ceremonial appearances or the ribbon cuttings, but the actual use of royal influence and connections to solve real problems and help real people. William had learned from years of military service and royal training that leadership meant more than just showing up. It meant taking responsibility and using whatever power you had to make things better. As they moved from the evacuation center to visit the flood zones themselves, William and Catherine were struck by the resilience and community spirit they encountered. In village after village, they met people who had lost everything but were already talking about rebuilding, neighbors who were helping each other without being asked, volunteers who had traveled from across the country to offer assistance. In the town of Hebden Bridge, they met a group of young people who had organized their own relief effort, using social media to coordinate donations and volunteers. These were teenagers who had grown up knowing William and Catherine as their future king and queen, and they were inspired by seeing them taking active leadership in the crisis. "You being here makes us feel like someone actually cares," one of the young volunteers told Catherine. "It's not just that you're royal, it's that you're here doing something." The comment stuck with Catherine because it captured something important about the modern monarchy. People didn't want their royals to be distant figures who only appeared for ceremonies and celebrations. They wanted leaders who would show up in times of crisis, who would use their positions to make a real difference, who would demonstrate through their actions that they understood their responsibilities to serve others. Over the following weeks, William and Catherine made multiple visits to the flood-affected areas, but they also worked behind the scenes to coordinate the relief effort and to ensure that the rebuilding process would be effective and sustainable. They used their charitable connections to raise millions of pounds for flood relief, their international profile to draw attention to the climate change issues that had made the flooding so severe, and their royal platform to keep the affected communities in the public eye long after the initial media attention had faded. The crisis also revealed something important about their partnership. They worked together seamlessly, each bringing their own strengths to the situation. William's military background and natural authority made him effective at coordinating with government agencies and emergency services. Catherine's warmth and emotional intelligence made her extraordinarily effective at comforting victims and inspiring volunteers. Together, they provided exactly the kind of leadership the situation required. The international media coverage of their response was overwhelmingly positive. Headlines around the world praised their hands-on approach, their genuine compassion, and their effectiveness in helping to coordinate the relief effort. But more importantly, the British public saw their future king and queen stepping up in a time of crisis and proving that they were worthy of the trust and responsibility that would one day be theirs. The flood crisis also strengthened their relationship with King Charles III. When he recovered from his health issues, he was full of praise for how William and Catherine had handled the situation in his absence. "You didn't just represent the crown," he told them privately. "You embodied everything the crown stands for: service, duty, compassion, and leadership. I couldn't be more proud." But perhaps the most significant impact of the crisis was on William and Catherine themselves. They had been tested in a way that no amount of training could have prepared them for, and they had proven to themselves and to the nation that they were ready for the ultimate responsibilities that lay ahead. They had shown that they could lead not just in ceremonies and celebrations, but in times of genuine crisis when real leadership was required. As the immediate crisis passed and the long work of rebuilding began, William and Catherine found themselves changed by the experience. They had seen the monarchy at its best, not as an institution of privilege and ceremony, but as a force for good in the lives of ordinary people. They had experienced firsthand the power of their positions to make a real difference, to provide comfort and hope when it was most needed, to bring people together in common cause. The flood crisis had also given them a clearer vision of what their reign would look like when their time came to wear the crown. They would be monarchs who were actively engaged with the challenges facing their people, who used their positions to serve others, who brought the ancient institution of monarchy into the modern world while maintaining its essential values of service and duty. In the months that followed, as the affected communities rebuilt and recovered, William and Catherine continued to visit and support the relief efforts. They attended the reopening of schools and businesses, they met with families who were returning to their rebuilt homes, they celebrated the resilience and community spirit that had emerged from the crisis. But they also used the experience to advocate for better preparation for climate change, for stronger community resilience, and for the kind of long-term thinking that would help prevent such devastating floods in the future. They had learned that being royal meant not just responding to crises, but working to prevent them, not just comforting victims, but addressing the underlying problems that created victims in the first place. By the end of 2025, William and Catherine had been transformed by their response to the flood crisis. They were no longer just the Prince and Princess of Wales in training. They were proven leaders who had demonstrated their readiness for the crown. The British people had seen them at their best, and they had liked what they saw. Opinion polls showed record levels of support for the monarchy and unprecedented enthusiasm for William and Catherine as the future king and queen. Most importantly, they had proven to themselves that they were ready for whatever lay ahead. The little girl who had grown up in a middle-class family in Berkshire, and the boy who had been born to be king, had found their destiny together, in service to others and in dedication to the timeless values that made the monarchy not just a symbol, but a force for good in the world. As they looked toward the future, William and Catherine knew that there would be more crises, more challenges, more moments when they would be called upon to provide leadership and comfort to their people. But they also knew that they had the strength, the partnership, and the sense of purpose to meet whatever came their way. They had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, ready to carry the crown into a new era, with confidence, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to serve others above themselves. The transformation was complete. Catherine and William had become the king and queen their people needed, even before they wore the crown. And when that day finally came, the world would be ready for them, because they had already proven themselves worthy of the trust and responsibility that would be theirs.